Oops. Accidentally. That wasn't chapter 1, section 4. That was chapter 2, section 4. I'm still using these. I was using these 25-year-old bookmarks. I got confused. So, anyway, let's do chapter 1, shall we? Section 4, parenthetical remarks. We got ahead of ourselves. If anybody gets this book, then please, especially when we get to the problems. Also, there's stuff, you know, we're going to have to, I don't know what to do. I can just hold it up. But, you know, when we have stuff like this, I don't know what to do. I mean, fair use-wise, can I? I mean, I can't. There's symbols, so I could rewrite them. I don't know. I have to figure that out. Anyway, parenthetical remarks. At this point, it may be useful to insert a few comments about what we do mean and what we do not mean by some of the things we have said up to now. When we say that every declarative sentence is true or false, we distinguish sharply between true and known to be true. If a sentence is known to be true, it is true. But many sentences are true that are not known to be true. Thus, from the fact that we do not know whether a given sentence is true or false, it does not follow that the sentence is neither true nor false. In like manner, we need to distinguish falsehood from oddity. Whether a sentence is true or false has no simple connection with whether in certain situations its utterance would be odd or misleading. For instance, if only one person has taken a certain examination and he has failed, it is probably misleading but clearly true to say all who have taken the examination have failed. Nor is truth incompatible with what is sometimes called logical oddity. It is supposed to be, quote-unquote, logically odd for Smith to say, "He has gone out, but I don't believe it." No one seems to deny, however, that someone else might truthfully say, "He has gone out, but Smith doesn't believe it." Or that Smith himself might later truthfully say in reference to the very same situation, "He had gone out, but I didn't believe it." This makes it evident that Smith might truthfully utter the first of these three sentences too. Of course, in most cases, one either believes what one says or attempts to conceal the fact that one does not, and hence it is difficult, though not impossible, to think of circumstances in which a rational person would utter the logically odd sentence in question. But that has very little to do with whether or not there are circumstances in which the given sentence would be true. Concerning the term, quote-unquote, possible, it should be noted, first of all, that we are not using this term in the sense in which the impossible is only what American businessmen take a little longer to do. Instead, we attempt with perhaps questionable success to distinguish technological, physical, and logical possibility. Something is technologically possible if, in the present state of technology, there is a way of doing it. It's physically possible if the hypothesis that it occurs is compatible with the ideal laws of nature. As technology advances, more and more things become technologically possible, but this advance always takes place within the domain of physical possibility. Many feats that are physically possible are now technologically impossible and perhaps always will be. Logical possibility is wider even than physical possibility. An event is logically possible if the hypothesis that it occurs is compatible with the laws of logic. If something is technologically impossible but physically possible, we may hope that eventually some clever man may find a way to get it done. If something is physically impossible, however, no businessman, engineer, or scientist, no matter how ingenious, will ever bring it off. If something is logically impossible, even the deity joins this list. At least, that's how the story goes. Another matter deserving explanation is our decision to take sentences as the objects with which logic deals. To some ears it may sound odd to say that sentences are true or false, and throughout the history of the subject there have been proposals to talk instead about statements, propositions, thoughts, or judgments, as described by their advocates. However, these latter items appear on sober consideration to share a rather serious drawback, which, to put it in the most severe manner, is this: they do not exist. Even if they did, there are a number of considerations that would justify our operating with sentences anyway. A sentence, at least in its written form, is an object having a shape accessible to sensory perception, or, at worst, it is a set of such objects. Thus, it is raining and es regnant, though they may indeed be synonymous, are nonetheless a pair of easily distinguishable sentences. And in general, we find that as long as we are dealing with sentences, many of the properties in which the logician is interested are ascertainable by simple inspection. Only reasonably good eyesight, as contrasted with metaphysical acuity, is required to decide whether a sentence is simple or complex, affirmative or negative, or whether one sentence contains another as part. Even so venerable and strange an issue as whether the conclusion of a sound argument is always somehow contained in the premises is not hard to settle if we take it as referring to sentences. But matters are quite otherwise when we try to answer the same kinds of questions about propositions, statements, thoughts, and judgments. Propositions, we are told, are the senses or meanings of sentences. They are so-called abstract entities and, as such, are said to occupy no space, reflect no light, have no meaning, or no beginning or end, and so forth. At the same time, each proposition is regarded as having a structure, upon which its logical properties essentially depend. If we were to study logic from this point of view, therefore, it would be imperative to have a way of finding out in given cases what that structure is. Unfortunately, no simple method is ever given. Since everyone agrees that sentences of wholly different shapes and structures may have the same meaning, the structures of propositions must not be confused with those of their corresponding sentences. Yet a perusal of the literature leaves little doubt that just this sort of confusion frequently takes place. Sometimes, to be sure, one is advised not to rely upon sensory perception at all, but instead to look directly upon the proposition by means of the mind's eye. Whoever admits that he is unable to do this leaves himself open to an obvious and uncomplimentary diagnosis traditionally employed in such cases. But when all the rhetoric has been expended, we are left once again with the problem of how in practice to ascertain the structure of propositions expressed by given sentences. Like difficulties are involved in talk about statements. These, though they purport to be different from propositions, clearly constitute another house of the same clan. Their partisans inform us that when we utter a sentence in certain favorable circumstances, we succeed in making a statement. The statement, not the sentence used, is properly true or false. The same sentence with the same meaning may be used to make different statements. E.g., if I say he won the election while referring to Mr. Kennedy, I'm making one statement. If I utter the same sentence while referring to Mr. Nixon, I'm making another. Also, different sentences with different meanings may be used in making the same statement. For instance, if I say Kennedy won the election, I have made the same statement I made earlier when using he to refer to Kennedy. But I have used a different sentence with a different meaning. Thus, as with propositions, the structure of a statement cannot be determined simply by looking at the sentence that is used in making it. Yet the friends of statements do not hesitate to classify them as singular, general, or existential, as conjunctive, hypothetical, affirmative, negative, necessary, contingent, etc., or to say that they are of subject-predicate form, or that some of them have the same form as others, or that they contain descriptions, and so on. Similar remarks apply to mutatis mutandis, to thoughts and to judgments. Thoughts, in addition to sharing some of the ephemeral qualities of propositions and statements, have another disadvantage as objects of logic. For if logic is about thoughts, the laws of logic seem to become laws of thought, and the whole subject turns into a bit of outdated psychology. Either the laws are presented as descriptions of how people do think, in which case they are false, or they are supposed to describe how people ought to think, in which case they are again false. Judgments, on the other hand, are perhaps the most obscure of all the candidates. According to one author, and it's hard to find to the degree, judgment is, quote, an action of mind, and consists in comparing together two notions or ideas of objects derived from simple apprehension so as to ascertain whether they agree or differ, end quote. From this point of view, logic is concerned with an act of mind called discourse or reasoning, quote, by which from certain judgments we are enabled, without any new reference to the real objects, to form a new judgment, end quote. That's from J. Vaughan's Elementary Lessons in Logic, 1909. But surely the question of whether, having performed a certain mental act, we are able to carry out another one is, if it has any sense at all, a question of psychological fact. And thus, once again, all questions about the soundness or unsoundness of arguments would likewise become questions of fact, to be settled by studying the mental processes of human beings. Such a conception of logic is impossible to reconcile with the actual practice of logicians, including, of course, that of the judgment logicians themselves. In the present context, the whole matter is not worth pursuing further, for, in any case, much of what we shall say about the logical properties of sentences can be carried over in a fairly regular way into talk about propositions, statements, thoughts, or judgments. In the main, we shall avoid sentences like "it is raining" and "he is here," which contain egocentric words as "here now," "this," "he," "you," "is," in the sense of "is now," and depend for their truth or falsity upon when, where, and by whom they are uttered. This sort of dependence can usually be obviated by using a sentence in which the persons, times, and places are specified, e.g., it was raining in Berkeley, California, 4 p.m. on December 28, 1961, or President Kennedy was in Vienna on July 24, 1961. By and large, if we confine, probably a good year for Benson, 1961, I bet. By and large, if we confine ourselves to relatively unambiguous sentences, not containing egocentric words, the following equivalences seem likely to be accepted. A sentence is true if and only if the proposition expressed by it is true. A sentence is true if and only if the statement that ordinarily would be made by using it is true. Thoughts and judgments may be treated analogously. If, therefore, the student has already acquired philosophic scruples against saying that sentences are true or false, he may utilize the equivalences given. Otherwise, he may safely forget about the whole thing. So he's just saying you can map logic about declarative sentences into thinking of logic as about judgments or something else. But see, if you do that mapping, then you're implying that there is a mapping. Anyway, in this book, we're not really going to get into those issues about how well does that map to nature. The fact is, I agree here with what Benson Mates is saying, that ultimately these are interesting questions. They may even be the main reason we want to look into logic. You know, these questions of where does it come from, what's it really good for, what's it tell us. But the real, bulk, except for a thin set of pages in the beginning, is just what all the logicians do. They have all the different ideas of where it comes from and what it's about and how it applies to nature. But the formalization of logic, for some reason, is more clear than the motivation of why you'd want to formalize it that way. So that's the end of section 4. It's funny. So, okay, the next section is section 5, logical form. And there's a bit of that, and then the first exercises.